Yes, welcome back. This is F a Rap Critic. I'm your boy Malik 16. No, I don't have a necklace that swings, but I stay shining. Fresh off the birthday week, as you can tell from the hoodie, continuing the theme. We just closed out Libra season beautifully. It's only right that we close out the entire month of October by concluding the review of my personal pick of classic for the month. And we're talking about the Sophomore album by Field Mob, 2002's From the Roota to the Toota. Now we're about to go into the category 2 breakdown of the rap performance on this album right after you take a minute to like and subscribe to the channel. While you're at it, you might as well pop on over to theraproota.com so you can cast your votes and rankings for both categories and all the dimensions for this album, as well as any other album that you see on the site, because that's what we're here for. All right, so get into that, and we'll get into this. We'll talk about the first dimension of category 2, which is dimension 1, personality and charisma. And so if there's one thing that this album has no shortage of, is personality. And there's multiple layers of personality here. I'll break each one down. Not only are the members Sean J and Smoke making a conscious effort to distinguish themselves from one another and introduce you to their individual personalities, or reintroduce you to their individual personalities, they're also establishing a group identity here to separate themselves as an entity apart from the rest of the rap industry at the time. So a group identity different from all the other duos, all the other Southern rap acts, all the other groups. And it's clear there that, they unify while they're also giving you slices of who they are as one and one. Now, on top of that, you could argue that they have personalities for their personalities. And what I mean by that is that the extents that they go with expressiveness to play up these dimensions, to get across the point of who they want you to take away from, is to the extreme side. Almost so much so that you can say that their personality emphasis kind of overshadows or dilutes the charisma aspect. Now, charisma is always the more subjective part of this dimension because it has to do with how much the artists pull you in and make you care enough to stay attentive throughout an entire album. And I think you get flooded with so much personality that you might lose how much you care because you don't know how much you got to know the core of these artists. There's so much expressiveness, there's so much over the topness. It just becomes easy to slip in and out of, is this just for entertainment or am I supposed to invest? And I think the members kind of veer more towards the entertainment side and lose some of the groundedness because of that. That's all something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. It's the personality and charisma. One thing you can't say is that they are boring. They have lots of character and they play up the character. That takes us directly into dimension 2, the suspension of disbelief or believability. So I was very cautious in my use of the word character just a second ago because I don't want to give the impression that Sean J or Smoke have created any characters on this album. The closest you get to that is the idea that they are now reestablishing new monikers and aliases for themselves. So much so that KAN, and you can tell that different tracks were recorded at different points in time because KAN is the only song on this album where they still refer to themselves by their original names that they were using on their first album, Collage and Boondocks Blacks. And you won't hear them reference each other that way at any other point in the album because they're really trying to drill home that they are now Sean J and Smoke. But in that, there's a lesson to take that they're really trying to give you themselves, so much so that Sean J is just using his government name. He's not going by a fancy tag anymore. And whereas Smoke is now Smoke and Chevy Pendergrass, but you don't really get to see any distinction of these alter egos. They're really just aliases. They're not, let me turn into this like we see a lot of rappers do. So we can put the idea of suspension of disbelief to the side for now and say that this is an album where Field Mob is asking you to believe them. And nothing is too far-fetched. Yes, they play up this whole Southern image, but you know, you're not getting barnyard raps. What you're actually getting is more street tales, but you would not know that from all the other elements surrounding this album and the group. There's a lot of talk about hustling and drug dealing, but never on a kingpin level. You know, they might brag about how good they are at selling drugs, and I don't know how easy it was back in 2002 to sell drugs in a town like Albany, Georgia, but they brag about it. It's incorporated into their braggadocio lyrics. And then you also are getting that same level of braggadocio with women, but at the same time, they're not too proud to be able to slip in lines about all the times where they couldn't get women, to self-deprecating levels. Like, man, I used to daydream about this. I used to masturbate. I got played like I was Urkel, you know, all of those things. And then on the more spiritual songs, there's regret and this tone of, man, I wish I wouldn't have spent so much time doing the street stuff that I did. I want to repent. I want to save my soul. So all of those things would lead the listener to believe that you are getting true reflections of the men themselves. So when I use the word character, I'm talking about them exaggerating their own characters, not creating characters. They're playing up so far these elements of themselves that it can become overshadowing because it's so bold and loud. And so, you know, it's always a question of how much you believe the rappers. In this case, how much do you believe Field Mob as they're talking about their adventures with women, their adventures with the streets, their adventures in the industry. I mentioned that they talk about women different ways. Yeah, there's songs about being cheated on. There are pimpish kind of songs, and sometimes it borders into misogynistic territory. But even with that, they add these like fail-safes within their verses that tell you, no, you know, I wasn't always this way. This is how I got here. And that provides balance. And so these are all things to consider when you're factoring in the believability aspect on this album, which takes us to Dimension 3. This is going to be a series of 3 of the most important dimensions that we're going to discuss in this category. And we'll start with Dimension 3, delivery and use of voice, because I honestly believe that this element is single-handedly the thing that keeps Field Mob from being listed with the greats. Their delivery is literally probably the only thing that separates them from being mentioned in the same breath as Eminem. They're 1 degree away from Eminem because of the choices they made with delivery. With delivery, it's not uncommon to see rappers on their second album still trying things out. And with Field Mob, because they are so multi-talented, we're talking about a group with members who could write melodic, they could write complex bar structures, they can sing, harmonize, and they're trying to display all of that. They can do voices, they can do impressions, they can do comedy, and they're giving you all of that in one short album. So that means a lot of that stuff gets jam-packed into songs at a time. And on top of that, the way they approach their verses has everything to do with the way it comes across. With delivery, it's a two-way experience. It is the way that it is received by the listener and the way that it's brought across. And sometimes everything else could get lost just because the way it was brought across. And then we talked in video 1 about the long hooks and how much attentiveness and acumen they had towards wanting to reach a wider audience. And you could see it in the beat selection, but sometimes the verse approaches are surprising. So first and foremost, you have the Southern accent. And of course, like everything else on this album, it's played up to the nth degree times 10. And that's another layer. That's another factor. Even though they have distinct voices, and distinct patterns, a couple things happen that have the effect of making them sound more homogeneous than they actually are, especially to the uninitiated and unfamiliar. If you are listening and you don't know who Smoke or Sean J are, and you're listening to the first time and trying to get familiar with them, I could see how it would be hard to differentiate, because they both make choices to use higher pitched voices on a lot of the songs here. Predominantly, they're rapping in higher pitched voices. Smoke, I mentioned, has this habit of harmonizing his verses. It's hit or miss, because on some songs it really flows and flourishes seamlessly. So a song like I Don't Want No Problems or Hit It For Free, they're gonna go. But on songs like Haters, the beat is already clunky, and so doing that, it has the effect of sounding like it's all over the place. They also ad-lib in similar ways. They use very loud, animated, cartoonish ad-libs in the backgrounds, as well as special effects that the engineer puts in, right? So you got a lot of noise on a lot of songs, and you actually get your brightest moments on this album on the more stripped down songs. When you hear songs like Cut Loose or It's Hell, and you get to really hear their voices clear, then you get a different feel as a result. There's a moment on I Don't Want No Problems where Sean J comes in, he leads off his verse with a real deep draw, enunciating every word and using a calmer kind of pace, and you almost wish he would have kept that up for a lot of the verse, but then, about 6 bars in, he goes into his regular high pitch, jumping around. Now, they also choose to sing in places where it might not make the most sense, and it just sounds a little off, and because they're not really singing. When each of them choose to really sing, there's a really melodic quality to it. When they're just singing the joke sing, then it has the same effect, ironically, as everything we talked about in the previous episode when we were talking about Common's style that he abandoned after his second album, where he was doing this kind of like jingle reference and felt like he had to animate all of his pop culture references and sing things with familiar tones. You get that, and then some of the patterns don't always match the beat, and Sean J is more prime to do patterns that don't go with the beat. Take an example like It's Hell. His choice to go on such a mellow, emotional, soulful beat and come in kind of like whiny just doesn't match as well. And that's the same thing you heard when on his verse on Haters. He comes in and was trying to do the Susan Vega Tom's Diner cadence over a beat that's already like coming at you aggressively with all these electronic sounds. And while Smoke makes these efforts to kind of add a gruffness to his voice, despite the high pitch, he might grunt in the middle of his verse or on the lead off, be like, Sean J does this thing that I call the desperation voice. And he's more prone to go into it more often than he probably should have on this album, because it's almost like Ghostface doing his cry and rap voice for most of the tracks on an album. It's only special because it comes in these rare verses or like 1 or 2 songs. But when you're doing it most of the time, it's like, okay, what's your real voice sound like? Why am I supposed to, how am I gonna get drawn into this? And I think Sean J sacrifices for that effect that he was going, and he tends to use it on verses where he's really trying to like either be super humorous or trying to feign pain. And I think because it sounds more humorous than anything, the pain effect gets lost in it. So we take his verse on It's Hell, where he's like, well, I was born poor, but I'll be damned if I'ma die that way. What an amount of day, and he keeps doing it. Sean J also relies heavily on the Slick Rick volley, where we know Slick Rick really, really immortalize this flow where he is pretty much talking to himself and answering his own question. Like, well, it was one of those days, not much to do. Sean J does that on almost every verse, but in that desperation voice, he's like, I'm named, well, they on it, I want to cut that. And so that's another penchant he has that floods the album and can overwhelm the listener. It becomes more slapstick than anything. And I think this is what I've been talking about all along. You can lose the desire to really be drawn in or take them as seriously. And the problematic effect of them stacking their vocals the way they do, even when they're not harmonizing, is that you also get lost in the mix. I remember buying this album on CD in 2002, knowing that they were killing it, but also being lost in all the noise. And their approach to delivery interrupts the listening experience because it becomes a very noisy album, to the point where when you get those cleaner songs that are more stripped down, you really appreciate it. So on It's Hell, where you hear Smoke come in for that third verse to end the song out, you're like, oh snap. It's a very straightforward, no bells and whistles, because he just wants you to hear what he's saying. It's the most straightforward flow, straightforward voice. It's not stacked and layered. There's no harmonizing. There's no ad-libs. It's just him. And you're like, wow. It stands out because it's a short album and it's one of the only times you hear him like that. But it makes you wonder, what if they would have done that more? Just like how I said Sean J came in on the beginning of I Don't Want No Problems. And you hear both of their verses on Cut Loose, and you hear what could have been, because you get to focus on what they're doing on the mic. If anybody who's been following my channel knows, one point I always really try to drill and drive home is that rap is so much about perception. You only get one or two shots, and if the perception is, oh, these are the funny boys, it's harder to, separate that. And I think this happened to Field Mob with this album, and this happened to Field Mob predominantly over their career. They got demoted by the hip hop audience, similar to how Busta Rhymes had been for a couple years in his career. And it's unfortunate, but something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to the second important category, dimension 4, the flow. Now, when I say that the only thing separating Field Mob from an Eminem is the delivery, is that because flow-wise, we need to stop everything right now and give Smoke and Sean J their flowers for being flow masters. Flow masters. You will be hard pressed to find rappers, especially in a duo combination, who can flow circles around competition or their peers the way that they do. These are guys that put a lot of effort into the patterns and structures that they were going to bring to any project, and this album is showcasing it all. And you can tell that it almost sounded like they were trying to impress each other. They were still in that phase. Rappers get into these modes where we're considering an audience, but it's easier to consider the audience that's in a smaller circumference. It's like, oh, my hood, my state, my coast, as opposed to thinking so globally. So there's a sentiment here. You can feel that there's like friendly competition, but also like, let's form like Voltron and we'll challenge anybody. And you hear that. And this is the craft here. The craft to still care. Sick of being lonely. It's a great example of really, they were straddling the fence there of being very wordy on a commercial song, but it worked. And so all the patterns that Sean J does, where he starts his verse with the "don't finish your statement, I'll be your replacement" sequence, really simple, but then he starts doing more complex patterns where he's like, moaning, and then he does this long drawn out ending couplet where he's like when the cow jumped over the moon, and then that's like a dish running away with a spoon. It takes him a while to get to that. So many patterns, and you're gonna hear that. You're gonna hear no shortage of 2 different flow patterns in every verse here. And so many more. That's at the very least. And we're talking about distinct flow switch-ups, not subtle flow switch-ups. So we take Smoke's leadoff verse on a song like Where You Going, and he's doing this flow, this unprecedented flow where he's kind of just throwing words up. He's juggling his words. So he's like, at times you and I growing up together in the past, jumping out, in the now, jumping in and up together. Like he's bringing the rhyme back in this very unorthodox rhyme scheme that is juggling, and then he ends it with a more straightforward hollow rhyme sequence with a bunch of E vowel sounds. So the differences here with the Eminem comparison and anybody who's a super syllable bar structure rapper, or Pharoah Monch or Lupe, is that Field Mob, they rap in awkward pockets. And so the delivery influences the flow a little bit, but they're so professional. They never go off beat, but you will hear Sean J veer and take more chances into risky territory where he goes right to the edge of going off beat because he's just packing his verses with syllables and landing in these crazy places. It's the difference between playing pool with professional pool players and pool sharks. And if I had to compare Field Mob to anything, they're like pool sharks. They're not just gonna hit the 8 ball in the corner pocket. They're gonna hit the 8 ball off the back of the 15 ball, hit about 3 different angles before landing it and still score. That is how both of them rap, but I will say that Sean J takes more risk because he will stretch words out and he will also pack words. While Smoke seems to focus more on, I joked in the beginning of this episode where I referenced Smoke's line where he's like, it's the way my necklace swings, because that's how he chose to end his verse on Haters, and rhyming it with some part in the scheme that was way earlier with the rhyming complement to swing. But Sean J does that way much more. Plus he's more liable to slow things down. But what they don't do that a lot of the seasoned flow masters that I talk about do is there's not the cleanness to it. And that's a delivery thing, which we just talked about in the last dimension, because it has the tendency to sound sloppy. Eminem will bend vowel sounds and syllables the same way that Smoke and Sean J do, but he'll pack it neatly and concisely where it forms a straight line. These guys are zigzagging and pinballing. So when they take the time to focus and give you a more uniform flow, which you're gonna hear more from Smoke, Chevy Pendergrass than Sean J on this album, it has the most beautiful effect, and you won't see a better display of this than on I Don't Want No Problems on Smoke's verse, where he effortlessly swings from about 4 different styles in the beginning and finishes out with one of the most steady hollow rhyme schemes that sound nothing like, oh, this is a hollow rhyme that I'm trying to be the rapper of the year for. It's just these words just tend to rhyme really smoothly, and he's rhyming Flatten the Beef with Patty Meat, Scratch to Me with Sunshine Anderson. I'll put that whole verse up so you can see he does the same thing on Hit It For Free. From the moment that he goes, even if the penny had a hole in it, cause I feel my flow is it for some foot dragging broke, pigeon it, go get it and go. And then he's like, cause I can go, give me some more chillins. It's just, what a verse. That verse blew my mind when I first heard it. On Cut Loose, Smoke is doing the triplet flow before the triplet flow re-emerged in all its popularity where everyone started using it. This is a decade before it even became known as the triplet flow. And then he smoothly ends the verse with his harmonizing, but in a mumbly kind of like words running together, like the way you running there on the there and there. So you're getting so many variations that they never use the same flow on any song. Their ability to bounce off each other is also another feature where, on the first track, KAN, as soon as Sean J ends his verse, Smoke comes right in it with a line that rhymes with the last rhyming line that Sean J just said. So they have that chemistry, and that's irrefutable. And you're getting so many flows within each verse. The only thing holding it back from being easily recognized as damn, these guys are flowing their asses off is some of those delivery issues we just talked about. This is all something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. It takes us to the third most important dimension in this trilogy of important dimensions. We're talking about dimension 5, the wordplay. Another thing that makes Sean J and Smoke top tier level MCs and lyricists is their wordplay. With them, there's not an unawareness of the tropes. They know that they're from a small town. They know that they're not from Atlanta. They know that they're Southern rappers. They know that they're unknown and not that popular outside of their region. And so they poke little jokes at it. And you get lines like when Sean J says, they say the South moves slow. Well, where's the speed limit? And all of the rhyming words that connect on those long form hollow rhyme verses that I pointed out by Smoke on Hit It For Free and I Don't Want No Problems, every word makes sense, and some of the words that they choose to put together creates this imagery and word connection that other rappers weren't doing. Just some of the things they were saying, other rappers wouldn't say things the way they were saying it. Like Sean J has a line on the tail end of Betty Rocker. He ends his verse by saying, the feds want to get at me because I'm selling heavy diddly 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 D. And I'm like, he didn't have to say it that way. He could have just said heavy D, but he went the extra creative mile to play it out, pay homage to Heavy D, reference Heavy D, use him, his name as an entendre. So you getting wordplay here at a high level. It's all something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. It takes us directly into punchlines. I should probably put this as a bonus important dimension. Dimension 6, the punchlines, poetic wisdom, and overall quotability. This album is almost like watching BET Comic View in this same era. I mentioned how important the humor element is to Phil Mob's approach, and that's because you can tell they spent as much time on their lines as they did on their flow patterns. They might have even traded back and forth. I don't know if it comes from a competitive spirit or a friendly spirit, like, hey, what you think of this? But you can tell if they weren't rapping, they would be doing stand-up, or they borrowed heavily from stand-up culture because they want you to hear their punchlines. There are punchlines that you're gonna miss because of their delivery, and there are punchlines that you cannot miss because they make it a point to emphasize them. So those slow down moments that I talked about, Sean J has a habit of doing. He wants you to hear it. So when he slows down and he's like, man, she gave me more hick keys than a redneck locksmith. There actually are 2 key punchlines that get used here just because they want you to know how clever they are with those key lines. So there's another one that wouldn't be politically correct. There are a lot of politically incorrect punchlines on this album. It was 2002, but again, as I mentioned, as Sean J being the riskier, more brazen and outlandish one, it's usually gonna come from him where he goes a little too far, right? So there's lines, there's a cat line, there's a crazy Jeffrey Dahmer line that would probably have so much relevancy now that, you know, that's being talked about in the media. But you get those from Sean J. He'll go the extra mile to get that punchline effect, whereas Smoke seems to focus more on style. He'll sacrifice some of the punchline delivery for style. He's like, listen to how much I harmonize on this verse, or listen to how, you know, I deliver this word more so than making sure you get it. Sean J doesn't have a verse on here where he's not gonna give you at least 2 punchlines. He manages to squeeze punchlines in on the song and where he's got a verse about spirituality. He says, I love LL, but God's the GOAT. And he says, we all God's property, not just Kirk Franklin or All I Know. Like, that's his thing. From the first song to the last to the middle. Even when they're on the metaphorical slavery based song, Sean J still manages to say lines like, they want to give me more lashes than mascara. So there's just no song is safe from punchlines when it comes to Sean J. Smoke, punchlines are rust. That's what they're given. They are not shy about it. There's so many, and there's so many punchlines that they were using before they got used in the mainstream ridiculously. So a lot of coke punchlines. Sean J says a line about I'm better with coke than hot Hennessy, or I move more keys than that Alicia lady. I was riding the bus with coke before Tyrese. Like, there's no shortage. But one of the most clever punchlines I've ever heard is Sean J says, said, you'll be SOL like leprechaun laxative. Drop the mic. As far as poetic wisdom, you get those in flashes because they're not rappers without substance. And so there's moments like on the songs, All I Know Is Hell, and even in some of the drug dealing songs where they're like, hey, I wouldn't be doing this if I made different choices. And so you get the more poignant moments on the deeper songs. I think one of the most poetic things said is the end of Smoke's verse on His Hell, where he finishes telling his very personal story about domestic violence and says, nobody knows the low my soul holds. And he repeats it just to really bring that point home. And then Sean J makes some really interesting points about church culture and how people are more focused on what goes on in the church than what you're coming to church for. So, I mean, there's plenty of moments, but the most quotable aspects of this album are going to be probably the more obvious low-hanging fruit, the comedy punchlines. Something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 7, the concepts. The most conceptual song on this album is a concept that I have not heard many rappers do, if any, and it's going to be Nothing to Lose, where both Sean J and Smoke are rapping from the vantage point, from the perspective of slaves. And yeah, you could say, yeah, that's playing up the whole Southern country angle, but this wasn't necessarily this crazy metaphor for life now, but it was commentary on still being at a socioeconomic disadvantage, which is why Slim Calhoun, we mentioned his verse being kind of off, but not too far off, because he's still talking about the struggle. He's just bringing it up to date. But really interesting perspective, because they're referencing the feeling of fear, running from master. They're referencing master, being tired of it, but being too afraid to do anything about it and wanting to escape, knowing enough to know that you want to change your condition, your situation, but not knowing how. Super creative stuff and a hell of a way to lead the album off. It's the second song on the album. The other songs you might hit into loosely conceptual territory. So the songs about women, I mentioned how they talk about women in different ways, even though it's rarely to the benefit of the woman. So the most loosely conceptual songs on here are going to be Where You Going and Cut Loose. Now, Where You Going is a little bit more straightforward. It's just about dealing with a clingy woman and noticing the difference in relationship dynamics. So in Smoke's verse, he's talking about how the relationship has run its course and now he's just trying to get away because he's living the single life. Sean J's verse, he's like, look, this is the woman that played me back in the day. We reconnected. Now I got the upper hand. With Cut Loose, though, we've heard plenty of songs about being cheated on with bitterness. This is all cheated on with humor, and even though the guys are the victims here, they're on the butt end of it, it's still an ego play because the whole reason for the breakup or the cheating is because they're just too good in bed. The point here is never to reinvent the wheel. No idea is original. It's always about saying the same things in new ways, in different ways, and that's what they do. Cut Loose is a different take on things. It reminds me of a song on Exhibit's Restless album called Effin' You Right, where the whole song was this comedic take on, hey, I'm only cheating so I can learn new ways to come home and bring these tricks to you. I always thought that was really interesting and creative, and that's what they're doing on songs like Cut Loose. Everything else is pretty straightforward. Betty Rocker, it's thinly veiled as being creative because of the name of the song, but it's just braggadocious drug dealing rap. So something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. That takes us to dimension 8, the external content, externalized content. How much is Field Mob rapping about worldly events, worldly affairs, environmental factors, the hood? There's parts of It's Hell where there's commentary, but those are mostly personal stories. So all I know is where you might get the most branching out and talking about things outside of their personal lives, because Sean J's verse. Sean J really is commenting on spirituality in the hood and how hood folk need to do better, church folk need to do better, and that God is the ultimate answer that everyone is gonna have to bow down to when it comes time. So why not make the change now? So he's not speaking about himself, whereas CeeLo and Smoke's verses are more about repenting and strengthening their personal relationship with God. Nothing to Lose, again, I mentioned how it's commentary, it's metaphorical, it's this idea of talking about the struggle from slavery times to modern times. So that's also another angle of talking about environmental and life factors. No Problems is situational, but it's more of a story. But in that, there's commentary because Sean J is saying things like, I'm from the home of racist cops and Confederate flag. You know, they're always making some kind of commentary because their awareness of their position is ever present. Despite the comedy, despite the silliness, they know very much and very well who they are and where they're from. Now, as far as Dimension 9, the internalized content, you're going to get a good amount of that because I mentioned some of those self-deprecating moments also give you vulnerability, which also makes what they're saying very believable because they're poking fun at themselves. They're talking about when they had to wear hand-me-downs, when they had to masturbate, when they were broke, how their parents were doing. And then you get these poignant moments like with Sean J asks, why my uncle had to die? He never did dirt. Should have been me. We talk about the repentance moments and the self-reflection, but none as profound as what Smoke does on his verse on It's Hell. I give credit to Oli because Oli is in there talking about legal issues and how the streets lead you to failure. But what Smoke does on It's Hell, where he's talking about witnessing his mother get beat by his stepfather, not once, but multiple times, and giving you this visceral window into his young life. He tells you he was 11. He tells you he felt helpless. He knows this dude isn't his dad and he wants to do something, but he did nothing. But probably the most standout moment is where he says, here she is bleeding and ish. And in my tape deck, 8Ball talking about beating the chick. And it's like those moments you don't hear in hip hop. It was unheard of, where you realize there's a whole generation at this point, 2002, who grew up on the hip hop that existed before, especially the Southern hip hop. And so he's pointing out the conflict, the internal conflict that he experienced, listening to this rap that's like glorifying, the pimp lifestyle and beating the woman to correct her and check her. And he's watching his mother bleed from being beaten and feeling really helpless. And he doesn't preach. He doesn't say, I'm going to make this change because of that. He just lets you know what a personal conflict those ideas introduce with his real life and that rap life. And I wish we heard more of that in rap, with others holding the music accountable, because those are serious conversation points to have. So you get a lot of that, a lot of them talking about the days when they were broke and they didn't have, and how they are now, the drug dealer references, but with the regret element. I wish I didn't have to do this, but since I did, I'm really good at it. I'm a pimp now, but I used to get played before. It took a long time to get to this point. So kick rocks, chick. That's where you get pieces of the misogyny. It's like, you broads are all the same. Some of the bitterness, some of the stuff we see in the manosphere right now. All these things are something to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. The content in both Dimension 8 and Dimension 9 takes us to the final dimension, Dimension 10, the storytelling. I mentioned the song I Don't Want No Problems. Smoke paints this picture masterfully of being in a club where drama breaks out. He doesn't want to incite the fight. He doesn't even want to give life to the fight, even after blows are struck. But it's like, if you need to take it there, we can. But I really just want to squash this because I was having a good old time. I'm sure you want to get back to having a good time. Sean J deviates. It's not so much a story for his verse, but Sean J gives you the clearest depiction of slavery with his verse on Nothing to Lose. He's telling a tale. He's keeping it in a family element. Smoke is talking about more about a general commentary on slavery work. Those are your two stories. They come next to each other. Where You Going is told in a story format, but it's not like this crazy linear story. Sean J's verse is more story format because he's talking about getting back with a woman who he had a second chance with and how that all went that day. Cut Loose is story format. Smoke keeps it more narrative than Sean J does. Sean J is just kind of like, okay, this is a dialogue, second person dialogue. Smoke is like, here's a letter I got on my bed. Let me tell you how it went from beginning to end. I'm reading this letter to you, the listening audience. And so that's the extent of storytelling there. That sounds like more than enough for a short album. But again, that's up to you to decide. These are all things to consider on a scale from 1 to 5 heartbeats. And with that, we conclude our Category 2 review of this album, my personal pick for the month, From the Roota to the Toota by Field Mob. Flowers and love to Sean J and Smoke. Shout out to Sean J's health. And with that, we conclude the best month of the year besides May. Until next time, y'all know what it is. F a Rap Critic. They talk about it while I live it. Word to meth.